Imagine a distant civilization in the past, under assault by various threats. What would that look like? How would that civilization actually respond to those threats? What actions would they take to ensure their survival? We have no shortage of examples of incredible fortifications across the land, built with knowledge that seems to surpass our current capability. But why would any great civilization build these wondrous fortifications, unless they were simply trying to survive their own incoming destruction by various threats that seem to be internal and external? Indeed, this is how we explain why there may have been a last emperor when we consider the Fourth Era civilization that we call Tartaria. The emperor in history. We have no shortage of emperors depicted in the histories of various cultures, and perhaps there's a reason for this. To this day, we appreciate emperors, and yet we loathe their existence. Here in this bust of Augustus, he seems to have a small homunculus, or a mini-me that's with him. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. And perhaps we start by considering the Roman emperors, as they tend to be the most well-known, at least in what we think of as Western civilization. And yet there's something very peculiar about these Roman emperors when we look at them. Again, we have the very original conflicting account. Some accounts say that these emperors were great leaders and individuals that brought the Roman Empire and ultimately the nascent Western civilization to the pinnacle, at least at the time. Or as the saying from Maximus in the original Gladiator, Rome is the light, and the rest of the world is chaos and darkness. Granted, that second part I just added. But when you look at these emperors, oddly enough, you're determined to see that there seems to be some sort of difference in some of them. And yet, many of the busts look exactly the same. Now, we could attribute this to the fact that they're made of marble, that many of these emperors were from the same family, and, of course, much like in the television shows, we have offspring that look exactly like their parents. But it's another one of those questions that we have to ask. We also consider the account that perhaps emperors, whether we're talking about Roman, Chinese, or any of the other emperors from across the cultures in our written recorded history, maybe one of them had to make a great sacrifice. A sacrifice that's reflected by emperors in fiction, such as the God Emperor in the 40K series. The God Emperor that had to make the ultimate sacrifice in order to save and preserve his civilization. We oftentimes wonder with these conflicting accounts of these emperors, did any of them have to make that final sacrifice? And the question I want to pose to all of you is, why do we have such a fixation on emperors? Whether we're talking historians or even the creators of fiction. There always seems to be an emperor, a great leader, a king, a queen, an empress. There's always one individual who seems to have a lot of the responsibility for the survival of a civilization that's attributed to this one leader. And indeed, when we look at the many different examples, whether we're looking at the Roman Emperor Trajan, or whether we're looking at one of the High Lords of Terra from the Warhammer 40K series, we oftentimes have these individuals who have a lot of responsibility that is attributed to them. Indeed, when you look at the bust of the Roman emperors that we have, one of the questions I've always had is, how exactly did they create these very accurate busts? And were they actually accurate in depicting the facial features? Such as with Emperor Hadrian here. Did they really know that his beard looked exactly like that? Was that the exact look in his eyes? Or was that merely creative license that was done by examining writings after the emperor had been alive? How historically accurate is all of this? Again, these are questions that we oftentimes don't ask because we have such an accurate account, or do we, of the existence of the Roman emperors and the imperial regalia of all of the Roman Empire. And it's the same questions that we have when we look at other civilizations and their respective empires and their great leaders. But was it actually inspired by something? Was there truly a leader who was responsible for the survival of a previous civilization? A civilization that encompassed all or most of the lands that we know of, and perhaps it even included lands that we're not aware of. Is it possible that such an individual would have such responsibilities? And that's the main reason why we have this fixation, if you will, for the existence of these single leaders. And whether it's a queen, a king, an empress, or an emperor, there is no shortage of historical and fictional accounts, although are the two interchangeable? It seems to be that they may be a little more interchangeable than we like to think, such as with the account of Maximus Thrax. Maximinus Thrax was stated to be between 7 and 8 feet tall if we go off of the Historia Augusta, which of course historians tell us it's not reliable. Imagine Maximinus Thrax being 8 feet tall compared to the average Roman being between 5'2 and 5'6. It seems to be an anomaly. And then of course there's the strange account of Emperor Lucius Aurelian, the emperor who was running all over the Roman Empire facing external, internal threats and currency revolts from within, and yet he still had time to pose for his bust being created. Of course, there are some that say that that's not actually his face. So what do we really know about these emperors? And even going on to the Byzantine Empire, another rather strange occurrence because this was actually the Eastern Roman Empire. The term Byzantine Empire was assigned later, oddly enough, by historians. So why exactly would we refer to an empire by a name it was not actually known by within the empire? Good reasons, I guess. Emperor Justinian, considered to be the one who really brought the so-called Byzantine Empire, that remember it was not really called, to its pinnacle. Did he represent some other individual? He had what is supposedly the great general Belisarius assisting him in his military endeavors. This is purported to be Belisarius, although we're not sure. There's also other odd individuals pictured here. And who exactly do these figures truly represent? And why is it that we have certain individuals that look like they might be out of place from a different time frame? This almost looks like F. Murray Abraham before he decided to star in Amadeus. And other strange-looking individuals. Were they actually the leaders who were assisting Justinian? That's what we'd like to believe. Or are these people completely different? Even looking at some of the soldiers that we have here, they have a strange look to them as well. Are these representing actual human beings, or are they different human beings? And indeed, it's not just emperors and empresses that we have to look at, but it's also the accounts of kings and queens, the individual leaders who seem to make a great difference within their nations that we still remember to this day. And yet, for whatever reason, it seems as though historical accounts assign or attribute more importance to them. And then, of course, we've looked at the account of Emperor Charles V. You might recall Charles V, he was the one who ordered the initial survey to be conducted of the feasibility of a canal that cut through the Isthmus of Panama, or Nicaragua, provided, of course, that, there wasn't something there that they could have used to make it easier, and the mainstream account tells us that there was. There's no shortage of the use of the title of emperor or king. What's really the difference, though, when we look and compare at the titles? An emperor who commands or rules an entire empire, and a king who rules a single nation. Did you know that there is still a recognized emperor to this day in Japan? And it's intriguing when we consider these various individuals and how they may have played a role within the affairs of their state or their nation state. It seems as though many of these borders and boundaries and national considerations are a lot more modernly imposed than we like to think. Why is it we have all this reference to these larger empires that may have existed? We also have to think about the fact that there may be certain nations that still exist with the same geographical boundaries, although there's a great debate about the whole concept of geographical boundaries. Was the existence of Japan in the distant past as limited as we've been told? Or did it represent something else, something much larger and more grand and encompassing than we like to believe? Was there a completely different arrangement of society and cultures in the distant past? Of course, it's considered taboo to even ask these questions to this day, but they're questions that we have to ask because we do have many accounts that do have strange parallels to them. And one of the most basic parallels is the actual method and manner in which nations, or empires, or the difference between the two, were ruled. In fact, we even have emperor kings, or king emperors, or queen empresses. What's really the difference between these titles? And do these titles have any function at all? We also consider the account of Napoleon. Did Napoleon really exist, or did he represent some sort of commander who had gone past his charter during the reset conflict that followed the last reset? Or is it just simply another tale designed to give a little bit of veracity to the current mainstream account? Was this individual actually just a commander who'd gone too far with his authority, or did he not even exist? I've left that to you in the past, and I ask you to let me know in the comments. We also have many empresses in history, such as Empress Irene, and even though we're told that this was limited to the Byzantine Empire, it should be noted that these individuals wielded a lot of authority and influence. There was even statements that potentially Empress Irene was going to join another empire. And I'm once again always amazed at the unique attire that we see in the paintings and the artwork of the distant past. Does any of this look like it would be practicable to wear at any point in time? Of course, the official explanation for whether this was a more modern or a distant past image is that people simply like to look resplendent in whatever they were wearing, having suitable raiment to show their authority. Here we have Pedro II, the last emperor of Brazil. Yes, there was a time when Brazil had an emperor. And oddly enough, we have more than a strange resemblance to Ulysses S. Grant, especially with the facial hair. But what is really the truth behind this account of emperors and all these kings, and whether we're considering the account of one of the many Henrys from the history or the official history of Britain, or any of the other lands that had rulers named Henry? Indeed, when you look up how many rulers are named Henry, it's very peculiar. And why would one of the Henrys be visiting his father in this very small, almost dare I say, outhouse-looking prison? Or perhaps you could even say it's a porta-john prison. Maybe they had that in the distant past. And here we have Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Yes, this gets even more convoluted when you consider the Roman emperors and the Holy Roman Emperors. And Henry V, who ruled from 1111 to 1125. What exactly is he holding in his hand there? It looks like he has the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch in his hand. Not exactly sure. But again, it goes to this entire account of who these emperors really were. And indeed, who were these kings? And oftentimes, the entire study of history, and if you ever had the pleasure or the misfortune, depending on your perspective, of going through a class on the Middle Ages of history at any university, you'll find there's all these confused and conflicting accounts of these kings who sought authority. It looks like this particular individual has the entire city of Antioch in his hand, and not just the Holy Hand Grenade. But what does it really reflect? And indeed, what does the account of all these other leaders that we have? Few people are aware of the account of Empress Matilda, and yet she was involved in the secession or the dynastic struggles that occurred in England during the time of Henry and so forth. And let's look at the leaders of Tartaria. Who were the actual leaders? We've looked at the account of Alexander the Great before, and we know that according to official history, Alexander the Great is stated to have been the Macedonian general who unified Greece and then went on a campaign to conquer the Persian Empire. We also have the account of Belisarius, and in previous explorations, we've looked at how these commanders may have been involved in a great final conflict. The final conflict for the survival of the Fourth Era civilization. The civilization that we refer to on this channel as Tartaria. We have all of these different maps that seem to depict some great threat. And indeed, in the Crisis of Tartaria, we looked at the threat posed by what we view as the Empire, or whatever you want to call it, the peoples of Gog-Magog. Was this an internal or an external threat that was actually facing the Fourth Era civilization? And we've posited that it must have been both an internal and an external threat. And perhaps that's the real account with all these emperors and all these great achievements. There's also the many accounts of corruption and difficulty that they faced. Everyone's well familiar with the account of Nero who fiddled as Rome burned. Was there some leader who was charged to attempt to save or preserve the civilization that didn't fulfill their duties, or had also succumbed to the corruption influences from within, as many others had? We've looked at the account of how Alexander the Great, also named in other societies and cultures which we would not normally associate with Alexander the Great, and the attempts of his forces to construct a wall to keep out these invading forces that threaten civilization. Indeed, many remnants of this Great Wall can still be viewed to this day in the Caucasus Mountain region, and it is attributed to the efforts of Alexander the Great, even though in the official history there's no account of Alexander the Great during his supposed historical time frame erecting these great fortifications. And it's also yet another account of, in the past, trying to utilize fixed fortifications to defend a civilization. Now, any military mind from any time frame will tell you that fixed fortifications are merely a monument to the intransigence of humanity. They tend not to work when you're facing a mobile army. But perhaps they make a lot more sense if you're trying to bring about the survival of your civilization and you're facing imminent annihilation. Or a more direct form for it is to simply say you're going into a hedgehog defense. You have no choice and you're simply trying to survive. And indeed, if we look at many of the great structures and many of the installations that are still around to this day, this suddenly makes a lot more sense. That the reason that they're still around is the fact that they were built to last and they were built to endure and to try to survive whatever forces and whatever threats that they were facing in that time. We've looked at other cities and other installations that still survive to this day that seem to have been constructed with threats from the air in mind. And you might recall our recent exploration when we looked at the lost tales of the Native Americans and all the settlements in the southwest of the United States that almost seem to have been built with the concept of defense or concealment from attack and observation from the air. A very unique and interesting series of details that once again paint conflicting accounts to what we've been told by the mainstream account of history given to us by the scholars who study and repeat what they are told to study and repeat. I always found the account of Alexander the Great the most intriguing because when you look at other cultures' accounts of Alexander, and you look at these supposed legends and myths that attribute him to being in the Caucasus Mountain regions and establishing these fixed fortifications to try to bring about the survival or try to enable the previous civilization to survive, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. But going back to the account of the actual emperor, I know that many viewers of this channel will certainly ask, Aurelian, you've theorized that in the past the leadership and the government of the Fourth Era civilization didn't rely on a strict hierarchy like we have now. And that's true. But I also have to consider the fact that we do have this idea of everything being brought about, all this responsibility, to one single leader. And whatever title we wanted to assign to that leader, it seemed to make sense to me that we have to consider the account that perhaps there was a series of leaders or one final leader, the Last Emperor, who tried to facilitate the survival of the Fourth Era civilization, the civilization we call Tartaria on this channel. But what kind of efforts did they really have to go through, and were they really successful? Ultimately, we can conclude that they were not successful, that indeed the entire civilization was destroyed, both from within and without. But what sort of terrors did they really face? What efforts did they really go through to try to survive the crisis? And we have explored the crisis before and what it was really about. We've had symbolic representations in recent events such as Olympic opening ceremonies that point to a different possibility concerning what the previous civilization may have faced. That it seemed as though that there was some sort of portal or some sort of access point that opened, allowing the others to access this land or this realm or whatever you want to refer to it as. And that this threat was unlike anything that they had faced. They had managed to overcome it in the direct conflict. But yet it seems that this adversary, this opponent, changed their tactics. They managed to infiltrate the very essential infrastructure, and indeed the institutions of the Fourth Era civilization. Perhaps they even had the ability to corrupt the individuals from within. And no doubt they would have targeted the leaders. They would have targeted those who had the responsibility. And perhaps that's the real cycle that we face. And it explains the very basis of the Five Era civilization that this channel uses to try to explain what came in the past. Because if we had 5 eras in the past, it comes about that it's always a cycle. There's always a civilization that manages to rise and reach a pinnacle. Now, how far each civilization that came before ours reached, we can debate it. But we have a lot of indicators that they managed to build wonders beyond our imagination. Indeed, no one can tell you exactly how a pyramid was constructed. We have many theories, but that's exactly what it remains to this day. Even from mainstream history, just theories in terms of how these structures were constructed. And whether we're talking about a pyramid or even an Art Deco building, we have so many questions. The main question being, why is it we can't construct these structures today in the manner that they were constructed in the past? And even when we look at the images that we have of the previous eras, what things may have appeared as, whether we're looking at the elaborate and geometrically precise star forts that may have existed in the Third Era, and they may well have been the foundation of the structures that were built on top of by the Fourth Era. And indeed, we still have these remnants of these wonderful structures and all this infrastructure all over the land that's still found to this day. It explains the great catacombs and all of the underground infrastructure that we can't really account for. Unless we're to believe that a group of people, especially within the United States, managed to construct rapid underground sewers and vast infrastructure in a very limited amount of time, and they managed to lay out many great cities and vastly increase their population, all within under 100 years. Of course, we've looked at other explanations for why in the current Fifth Era we seem to be unable to construct a very simple, small pyramid out of the same construction materials, or whether we're talking about one of the great many dome buildings, such as a national or state capitol that we have across the land, or whether you want to call it a capital or a palace or whatever name we have for these current structures. We seem to have a lack of ability in constructing them, and it's one of the main components of evidence that we have that indicate that the accounts that we're given are not accurate. Of course, some people will say that just because you can reference something that's written down somewhere, it's incontrovertible proof. It is an incontrovertible fact that it must have happened. And it may be true. But it's very odd when you consider it and you apply a little critical thinking that certain things don't add up. Oftentimes, no one will ever bother to try to answer the logistics question behind all the wonderful structures that were constructed. And perhaps that's really where the concept of the last leader or the last emperor of Tartaria really comes into the final question. What were the last achievements of the previous civilization? What were the very last structures that they completed before their downfall? And oftentimes we think that it must have been the structures that we've looked at, the monasteries and the fortifications that we have, that were built as a last-ditch effort to try to preserve any bit of the civilization to make it to the next era. And perhaps it's because of those efforts that we even have any of the clues that we do to this day of the wonders that may have come in the past. Many people simply accept the fact that our civilization has always been on the ascendant, that there's only one civilization that's ever existed, that it goes from the evolution, if you will, of human beings from other forms of life, the changes in the development of intelligence, and as Carl Sagan liked to say, and then we just started to talk. And that was really the birth of our civilization. And you know what? It may all be true, but there's so many fallacies with it when we consider the critical thinking aspect. We have to be open to other possibilities. And it's one of the reasons why we've embarked on these explorations, because we have to search for explanations for what really came in the past. We have to really understand who we are. It's the greatest endeavor of human existence, because it's part of our journey, to look within and to understand who we are, and most importantly, who we have the potential to be. Because if we consider ourselves free of this corrupting influence that we always come across, this unfortunate focus on things that perhaps do not suit our best interest, then it could be possible that we could achieve the wonders that we had in the past. And maybe one day we could even have a civilization that exceeds those wonders, that we really could explore new areas and we really could develop ourselves from within. And who knows, maybe the real answer is perhaps something that transcends the physical realm. And oftentimes this blurs the line between spiritual and temporal affairs. And it's one of the main reasons why I'm not in the practice of telling people what to believe. I don't have to tell you what to believe. I respect the fact that you can believe whatever explanation is most fitting. Maybe you think Carl Sagan's explanation in terms of the history of the land is most fitting. Or maybe you believe in what you find in the Bible or any of the other holy works as the real explanation for how things came to be. I don't believe in discounting anything, because I believe that all the clues and all the evidence is scattered across anything and everywhere. And indeed that would make the most sense because of the fact that we have so much division that seems to be imposed within our current civilization. Now, whether this division is intentional or it's simply the unintentional consequences of the current arrangement of our society. We can certainly debate that. But we can't deny that it is very present. And we certainly can't deny that there seems to be many individuals who follow what appears to be a planned process, if you will, of depriving us of the ability of searching within. And perhaps that's the most compelling thing when we consider the account of the Last Emperor of Tartaria. And indeed we consider an entire civilization across the land that worked together. Now, oftentimes, people misquote me or misattribute the fact that I tried to suggest that this civilization was egalitarian. I don't think there was anything with egalitarian, at least in terms of how the people all existed. It just seemed to be that the civilization had achieved a balance by balancing both the needs of the individual with the needs of the society and the overall civilization itself. Imagine if you had a civilization that, instead of trying to conform individuals to fit in a box, actually catered to the strengths of the particular individual. What could you achieve? And if you actually had a civilization that focused on this and achieved spiritual awareness, in addition to the limitations of physical reality, then suddenly they could overcome those limitations. Suddenly, with a long enough timeline and a focus on both the artistic and the practical, you could achieve many of the great wonders that we see all around us. And if there was one individual who had found themselves directing this and had all this responsibility attributed to them, then perhaps it really showcased the fact that instead of achieving the balance, they had become unbalanced. And ultimately that led to the final downfall of Tartaria. It's all a very compelling account, and it's one of the reasons why I needed to consider the Last Emperor of Tartaria. We really needed to look at how this all could have come down with the leaders and what role they played. Were they able to preserve the elements of civilization, or has it all just simply been diminished to myth and legend, and that's all we have, with details that have been scattered, along with the final destruction? We have to take the hypothesis that it seems that the final destruction occurred much more abruptly than anyone at that time had any idea that it was going to happen. And indeed, if you think about the fact that all the records were completely destroyed, that there was a diaspora and a dysphoria that was inflicted on the population all across the land. The other thing that we aren't entirely sure on, but we have clues, is how exactly was the corrupted internal portion of the previous civilization responsible for the destruction of the people. And perhaps a destruction beyond just a physical death, but also the destruction of the society. Imagine if you have an entire society that wants to forget what had happened in the past, because in their mindset it was so terrible that they did not want to retain their own knowledge, that they willingly gave it up. And indeed, there have been a couple allusions to this, and whether you're looking at a fictional story or there's even historical accounts, where it seems as though the people willingly gave up the understanding of their own identity. It seems like it's something that goes against everything that we would expect people to value and believe. But we have to ask the question, is it something that came internally, or was it external? Did the people really reach a state of despair that they wanted to forget their past? Or was this just simply an approach that was imposed upon them? Imposed upon them by corrupted leaders, the very leaders who had been corrupted by the forces that had attacked their civilization externally, and had now found the ultimate vulnerability. And perhaps that vulnerability stays with us to this day. These concepts of pride, of self-righteousness, or another way of saying it, the infuriating nature of righteousness. The idea that you're right and someone else is wrong, and that gives you the right to do anything to make those people see you're right. Perhaps that's something that we oftentimes overlook. And yet there's no shortage of depictions and illustrations that show us that this is indeed what had happened in the past. That there were groups of people who were turned against their fellow humans and were all too willing to engage in this open destruction. And what sort of forces of destruction did they really have at their hands for their disposal to tear down their own civilization? What sort of weapons did they have? And were these weapons limited to machinations, or were there biological weapons that we can't even begin to imagine? Indeed, if you step back far enough and you look at all the possibilities, and we do have evidence of what the civilization before achieved in terms of building its own infrastructure, then we also have to consider what sort of forces they had at their disposal to destroy that civilization. Now, it seems clear that there were some structures in some areas that were more susceptible to the destructive effects of these technologies, whether we're talking about frequency or sound technology, or perhaps even some sort of energy projection technology that we can't even begin to imagine. It approaches the realm of science fiction. And then, of course, there's all the methods of destruction that we have within science fiction and high fantasy accounts. Creatures, chimeras, and other strange hybrid creatures that have the ability of destruction within them. And once again, we'll be informed that this is all just simply product of wild imagination. It's all just a fiction. Yet these same people will also believe that people who simply had no greater technology than horses and carts and sailing ships managed to build these very impressive structures. They managed to build star forts and great cathedrals. They did so during a time when their civilization and their society was vastly uneducated, again according to the mainstream account, and also susceptible to various plagues. Now, is that what really happened? Or is that just simply what we're informed happened, and that what really happened was something far more devastating and far more calculated, far more concentrated with its destruction of the previous civilization? And don't forget what had happened to the people. And we always have that disturbing question. Did the people really understand what was happening? Did they want to forget their past? Or was it imposed upon them? The final account of the last Emperor of Tartaria. Was this one single individual? We can certainly look at all the societies and all their respective cultural histories for the important individuals and leaders within their respective histories. We also have to attribute to the fact that looking at those histories, there is quite a fixation on the emperors and the great leaders who seem to make a difference. And whether we're talking about the East, the West, the North, the South, or any of these civilizations, we have no shortage of accounts of the achievements of their great leaders in the past. Indeed, the achievements which only seem to bring about a brief period in which some sort of unity was achieved. And of course, the recurring theme is that over time it eroded. Is that really just a microcosm for what we have at a larger scale when we look at the eras of civilization? It may be true. But there's nothing wrong with actually looking at the details and trying to come to a conclusion and understanding. Indeed, we're informed that the period of the Middle Ages, the knights and their concept of chivalry was not true, that it was a much darker time and that it only applied in certain cases. Yet we're also informed that during the Middle Ages it really wasn't that bad. There really weren't dark ages. Always interesting when they retract these accounts and walk them back. Perhaps one of the candidates for the last Emperor of Tartaria could have been the account of the legendary Prester John. Did Prester John really exist? And does it warrant an exploration in and of itself? Looking at the official historical accounts of Prester John. Now, officially, the efforts to locate Prester John had failed because Prester John was just a myth. And all the efforts of the Portuguese and Spanish sailors and navigators to try to locate the kingdom of Prester John failed, or it was attributed to something else. But could there have been some sort of historiosity with this individual? Could this have been one of the last surviving leaders? And perhaps, we don't know the exact timeline, what sort of influence and capability did this individual have? And why exactly did this final enclave itself finally fall? These are all questions that we're going to consider in upcoming explorations. Because if we concern ourselves with who the last Emperor of Tartaria was, perhaps it's not as important as who it was, in terms of what their final achievements did bring about. Because it seems clear that there was enough detail that survived, that this concept was never really wiped away from the collective conscience of human beings. Now, it seems as though there's only certain human beings that are even willing to consider it. And when there's others who tell you that you're not allowed to think certain things, or you're not allowed to even concern yourself with certain things, or that even by thinking or considering a possibility, you must have some sort of mental aberration, then you suddenly realize that it has nothing to do with the actual objective effects. It has everything to do with total control. And another example I'll give you is the Great Empire of the Dawn from the Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire series. And it was very similar to some of the accounts of the great legends of China with the legendary sage emperors, beginning with a great god emperor and then followed by others who succeeded them, with the Onyx Emperor, the Topaz Emperor, and the Amethyst Empress. And as time went on, these emperors had shorter lifespans. And then eventually, they were corrupted by the Bloodstone Emperor, an individual who brought about a near destruction and a complete destruction of the great Empire of the Dawn. Perhaps that's an analogy, a parallel for what may have happened in the past, where we either had a family or a series of individuals, and perhaps the last individuals who really cared about preserving civilization. Imagine that concept. Leaders who actually put the people that they were supposed to be in charge of before their own needs. We certainly like to say it in this current civilization, but we're rather hard-pressed to find actual examples of it really happening. Is it possible that there was a civilization where there was a leader that actually cared that much and really put the needs of the civilization before their own? Or is that simply a fiction, a fantasy? Is it really possible that there was one point in time where there was a leader that actually cared that much? Or was it just simply the product of high fantasy? And indeed, we often find this debate, this conflict, this internal and this external conflict in all realms of official history and fiction. But as always, I leave it to you. What are your thoughts? Was there a Last Emperor of Tartaria? Who was it? How effective were they? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.